radars on the northern slopes have just picked up an unknown object over the North Pole. It's headed south at a very high rate of speed. 9 objects at 40,000 feet, descending rapidly. We're now scrambling jet interceptors to identify this unknown track.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. This is Shelley Lesher. For those of you who celebrate Christmas, you know what happens tonight. Children all over the world will leave cookies and milk out and stay up late at night trying to catch a glimpse of jolly old Santa and wake up with presents under the tree. If you live in the U.S., you will undoubtedly know of Santa Tracker. Maybe you and your children see how close the sleigh is to your house. But do you know the origin story? Well, let me tell you the story that is told at this time of year. In fact, even the Colonel's children told it on StoryCorps. As it goes, it was 1955, and there was an ad placed in a local Colorado Springs newspaper. It told children to call in and talk to Santa. But they misprinted the number and instead gave the number to a secret hotline at the Continental Air Defense Command, now known as NORAD. When a child called this number, he got Colonel Shoup, who was annoyed at first until the child started crying. And the colonel decided to play along, ho, ho, ho and such, and asked for the child's mother, who informed the colonel that this was the number printed in the paper. The command center was inundated with calls from children, and the colonel put a few airmen on the phone to answer it and pretend like they were Santa. The airmen made a big joke about it, and Colonel Shoup had a great idea. He phoned the local radio station and said, "This is the commander at the Combat Alert Center, and we have an unidentified flying object." "Wait, it looks like a sled." The radio would call in every hour and ask for an update. So tonight, gather around and listen to Marty Pfeiffer tell you the true origin story of NORAD Santa Tracker. But make sure the kids are in bed. This one is not safe for those who still believe, and may also contain some foul language. This episode is edited down from the full conversation Marty and I had. If you would like to hear more, head on over to mynuclearlife.com to find out how you can join us on Patreon. I thought perhaps My Nuclear Life should release a Christmas episode. And what is more appropriate than talking about Santa?
Saint Nick flying through our airspace, potentially unmonitored, maybe a Russian agent, comes from the North Pole.
So he could be a Russian agent? How do we know for sure?
We don't. I mean, there are those photos of Putin with Father Christmas, or what is it in Russian? I'm totally blanking it. We learned it in, Dead Moroz. No, it's not Dead Moroz, is it? In any case, Saint Nick or Father Christmas is he's Arctic Circle. He's got a lot with the sort of Nordic countries and Russia. And he comes over the North Pole. I mean, if he's leaving directly from the North Pole to come into the continental U.S., he'd be following a very similar trajectory to, say, Soviet or Russian ICBMs. Or bombers.
So should we be concerned about him?
For many reasons, not. If Santa actually existed, I would say one thing we should worry about actually is that we may mistake him for a Russian attack and be like, fire everything, or that we would shoot him down. And Hayes Brown had a really trenchant comment in his MSNBC piece a year or two ago about drone casualties. And he asked, if NORAD actually shot Santa down, would we be told? And would there be any accountability? And would there be any conclusion from the investigation other than, yep, all procedures were done. It was a tragic accident. Sucks for Santa.
I guess I don't know what to say. Would we be told?
I mean, so Hayes was writing about it in the context of drone casualties and the casualties of civilians with drones. Honestly, shooting down Santa would probably be a little bit more discreet than shooting down an airliner. So, USA airspace is shit. Defense was shit, as we saw prior to terrorism attacks on September 11th. The United States had generally, according to the declassified documents that I've read, for its defense of its airspace against nuclear weapons into the 70s, say. So for defense of the USA airspace in the 70s on, at least, the statement was that the United States of America could defend against a limited bomber attack with strategic warning. So basically, we didn't really have much stood up day to day to be able to launch fighters on tactical warning that, like, hey, Soviet bombers are coming over the North Pole in 20 minutes. What are you going to do?
So what's strategic warning?
So the United States of America has long tended to keep our nuclear forces on a high level of alert such that, for instance, ICBMs can be fired off within 10 minutes, say. If a president decided to, the process would take 10 to 15 minutes or less. So the Soviets set up Project Ryan, which was looking for strategic warning for things like, are people staying in the war planning offices late at night? Are there movements of troops? Are there movements of planes? Tactical warning is, our radars have picked up something headed our way. Strategic warning would have been the buildup of forces on the Ukrainian border in February and January, and also the USA interception of Russian communications that they had already made the decision to invade sometime previous. Tactical warning was when everybody's iPhone said, hey, there's a huge traffic jam at the Russian-Ukrainian border. We don't know what's going on.
How good is our radar at detecting these incoming projectiles?
For ballistic missiles, we have geosynchronous orbiting infrared satellites that generally do pretty good because you're still in burnout as you go up above the clouds. Cruise missiles are a very difficult situation in that they require broad, relatively high fidelity radar coverage of an entire coast, an entire geographical outline. And Washington, D.C. has what's called the Integrated Air Defense System, or IADS or whatever. It's all not great right now. So this is one thing the United States says that we worry about and that we are continuing to spend lots of money. In reality, I think that it is always highly optimistic to plan on having your national command authority in control in the event of a nuclear war. Whether that's because somebody's going to park a nuke in their embassy or in the nearby port, or because they're going to use a low-flying cruise missile that you don't see or mistake. Shooting down cruise missiles is not easy. Shooting down ballistic missiles can be a lot harder. And I doubt, for instance, that some of the numbers coming out of Ukraine, for example, 90 cruise missiles were fired, 73 were shot down. That seems excessive to me for a variety of reasons. And I don't know that that will ever get totally cleared up.
So what is NORAD?
NORAD refers to North American Air Defense, and it was stood up with the United States and Canadian joint. It's in Cheyenne Mountain. Now most of the daily operations take place outside of the mountain, and the mountain long ago ceased being particularly effective as a defense against nuclear attack. And NORAD is one of the fusion and decision centers for information coming in from U.S. and other radars, satellites, and so on to monitor airspace and look for things like enemy aircraft or cruise missiles or ballistic missiles.
Okay. How did NORAD get involved with Santa on Christmas Eve?
Rank cynicism and political public relations efforts. So the myth, the happy, warm and fuzzy myth.
Well, so I'll say what I've heard.
Yes.
Is that on Christmas Eve, a child phoned and they dialed a wrong number and got NORAD and asked where Santa was. And the colonel who answered the phone didn't want to disappoint the child, so he then was able to tell the child where Santa was and instructed everyone at NORAD to answer the phone and tell the children of the country where Santa was. That's the story that NORAD tells about the birth of Santa Tracker.
Yeah, not so much.
You're telling me that's not true?
Oh, I will tell you it's an outright lie, just like I told NORAD tracks Santa on Twitter before they blocked me, which is some real Christmas spirit. We can also ask why these details matter in terms of the sort of founding narrative. And to a certain extent, they do and don't. They do in that they help us to reveal a pattern of public relations guided storytelling. And they don't in that if we're talking about NORAD Track Santa now and why that function should be transferred over, say, to the State Department or the NOAA, the weather people, then it doesn't really matter how it starts so much as what it is now and our issues with militarization and children and domestication of nuclear warfare. And I would argue that it does matter in part because it's a lot easier to transfer over those sorts of programs when they don't have such like a happy-feely narrative of like Commander Shoup, who was there to be like, yes, Mr. President, incoming nukes, we should fire everything now. And by the way, in 1955, Colonel Shoup would have had pre-authorized, pre-delegated authority from Eisenhower to use nuclear weapons for the defense of U.S. aerospace in the event that an attack was underway and Eisenhower couldn't be contacted rapidly. So
he didn't even need presidential approval at that point to launch nuclear weapons?
Under certain circumstances.
Under circumstances.
Could be kind of loose, and that he may have delegated to others. The pre-delegation stuff was... Yeah. We also, in 1957, this is again getting a little bit farther afield. So part of this is tied up with the fact that we were using large numbers of nuclear weapons for continental air defense at the same time that we were dependent upon, or that we had a declared strategy of massive retaliation and dependent upon nuclear weapons as almost a panacea for security in many ways, or at least, once we hit to general war. And so the 50s were a period of really intense fear. And so to get back to the story, so point being, a lot of people were not super happy in the 50s about the possibility of imminent nuclear warfare, including from North. And my understanding is that the phone call actually didn't come on Christmas Eve, that it was a misdialed number, that Colonel Shoup, as he later recalled in an interview, said something like, I'm worried about things coming over the North Pole, but it isn't Santa. So he was a little brusque and kind of hung up. And at that point, somebody in discussing this realized, this could be really useful. And that's kind of how it got born, starting with print and print ads and, puff pieces and papers. And then in the 60s, moving toward things like radio and the distribution of records with tracks that stations could play, like, here's where Santa is now, interviews, photos, and then into the 70s in particular with commercials and with video, 80s, and then the 90s with the internet, where at some point NORAD Track Santa did partner with Google, although they later stopped partnering with Google, and now Google has its own Santa tracker, to the point where NORAD Track Santa has become, in a surprisingly to me, deeply embedded experience for a lot of people. And so when discussing NORAD Track Santa and some of the things I dislike about it and why I think it shouldn't exist and should never have existed, some of the responses are, right, you Grinch, I remember being in Germany and this, and it helped me to feel whatever. And all of that is valid and true. I'm not trying to take away people's happy feelings. I would like to suggest that we cast a more critical eye on the history of NORAD Track Santa and that we critically reconsider whether or not NORAD Track Santa should continue as it does.
So I have a few questions going back. So Colonel Shoup was real?
Yes.
And there probably was a misdialed call. So, there is some truth in the original story.
Yeah, like most myths.
Okay, but then they really played it up. Like, so then they saw, wait, we have this opportunity to change our image or to add something to our image. Like, look, we don't just watch for incoming nuclear missiles or nuclear weapons or planes. We don't only look for things that are coming to destroy you. We're also going to give you warm, fuzzy feelings about Santa.
In fact, my understanding is that it was extremely explicit in terms of the public relations benefit from the beginning. And everybody has not everybody has the same motivations, and the same people can have differing motivations and ways of thinking about things. So this is not to say that the people involved with NORAD Track Santa and its creation were evil nuclear fetishists who saw this only in one way. Although one or two of them, there were elements of that.
Right.
And it was absolutely picked up on as a way of domesticating nuclear weapons, of domesticating NORAD, of creating public awareness of NORAD, of casting NORAD as not only tracking Santa, but actually providing airspace for Santa, making sure that Santa had, safe transit. So this was in one of the commercials they have I want to say it was the 70s, they have an image of people like, oh, you'll never believe what we've seen on this track. It's a big fat guy with reindeer, and then they announce all right, it's Santa, everybody open up your airways, sort of thing. So there's still an invocation oftentimes of the protective aspect. And honestly, NORAD Track Santa points us to how our airspace is heavily militarized in addition to the commercial aviation tracking. The notion that Santa has to have clearance for airspace for civil. Right, if we did it just through the FCC, that would be one thing. The notion that it's also through NORAD brings in that particularly militarized aspect of okay, if you don't belong here, then we're going to shoot you down or something. Or you have to protect Santa from the godless communists back in the day.
So we're teaching kids at a really young age that America is something that needs to be protected.
Oh, God. And I wouldn't even necessarily... That's a very broad statement that's very difficult to disagree with in totality. Certainly there are aspects, but yes, it does contribute to... It can. I don't think that NORAD Track Santa is the major vehicle through which we create imaginaries of domestic vulnerability, and it's one of them, absolutely. And it's also one way that a military institution set up explicitly for handling nuclear warfare and continental air defense got articulated to something else explicitly as a way of getting the American public more on board with USA nuclear weapon policy.
It definitely normalizes it, though.
Absolutely. Why does NORAD exist, right? It exists, continental air defense, and Santa. And those two things are really, like I said, this is one reason I would love to switch it over to the Air Traffic Control Network or over to NOAA, the weather people, because I think that that's a much better fit for me in terms of if we want warm, happy fuzzies about Santa, I like the air traffic control network that keeps planes from running into each other constantly and whose workers are overworked and underpaid and enjoy enormous amounts of stress on their job, and yet still, which is not to say that people at NORAD aren't, the levels of stress are different and so on. But I want FAA to have it, right? FAA is dedicated to safety and to managing. FAA does not have a global reach per se, but that's so secondary.
If you ask someone, what does NORAD do? What do you think most people's response is going to be?
Either Santa, I don't know, or something nuclear war related. We've learned a lot from movies about and seeing Cheyenne Mountain and those giant doors. War Games, for instance, occurs at NORAD. And you see the big door swinging shut into the mountain.
Unless you're in an apocalyptic film where NORAD shows up in some sort of apocalyptic sense, right? Because they have a place that's impenetrable.
It's not, but...
But that's the myth, right? Unless you're into those sorts of movies or TV shows, or you're in a space like we are, I think people either don't know what it is or it's Santa. It's Santa Tracker. Like, that's it.
And for NORAD and for the military, the USA military, and as a result of my Freedom of Information Act work, some of the materials that I've gotten released have included, for instance, the United States Strategic Command's social media or media strategy guide and so on. And I think it's always worth keeping in mind that our taxpayer dollars, and as I've gotten older, I'm more and more, I'm a taxpayer, damn it! And my taxpayer dollars go to supporting public affairs and public relation efforts that are designed explicitly to create certain images of certain things like NORAD or, for instance, US Stratcom, which really drives me up a wall sometimes, and it's posting on Twitter about what deterrence is or isn't as I sit in the background and like gibber, that's not what deterrence is! That's not what deterrence is! You know? And so it's one thing that I try to remind myself of when I get cranky sometimes about, why don't people know more about this? And it's partly because there are enormous amounts of money and effort being expended to make it so that we're okay with this. And this is no different than during... It is different, but in the larger sense, I mean, civil defense, here, go dig a shelter because we're unwilling to pursue other policy options than large-scale nuclear, war in the event of things not going the way that we want.
Why were you blocked by NORAD on Twitter? It seems like that's quite the step to have been taken against you.
It was not for anything egregious, egregiously offensive, or I can even find the tweet for you. I forget what day it was. This was last year, I want to say. And let me add, sometimes people or institutions wander into the Venn intersection of being wrong and things I happen to
feel passionately about.
Exactly. And that is a space. That is a space to occupy. So I would imagine that what pushed it over the edge were the multiple 5-tweet threads in response to various news articles and people calling other people Grinches for not liking NORAD, and me proclaiming that NORAD tracks Santa had often been an outright cynical public relations ploy, and that it shouldn't exist, and that it was a net negative for us and our country, and that it was doing bad things. So I didn't join in their Christmas spirit.
I mean, I get your point. I mean, you're not trying to take it away from people because it's fun. I mean, it's fun to have kids track Santa, but that it's a military operation is behind it is what your objection is.
Yes, and it's the sanctimoniousness of NORAD tracks Santa that really, and the lying that gets to me in that.
Well, because it is a branding, right? NORAD tracks Santa. It's not just Santa Tracker. It's NORAD Track Santa. Wait, NORAD Track Santa is trademark? Like Santa Tracker is trademark?
NORAD Track Santa is trade. There are other parts of it that are trademarked, yes. I have not fully
Holy cow.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's a thing. So during a government shutdown, NORAD Track Santa was run. I have a tweet about this, a very angry tweet about this. And it kind of got pushed to the back burner for a while because of other things like suing the Department of Energy, and I can't file Freedom of Information Act requests at the moment. And so I have not been able to fully unwind exactly whose money is what and where and to what extent. It may not be any taxpayer money other than I don't think that's true. I think that it is a mix, and certainly people participate. I think they're all volunteers. They're given space and so on. And it's mostly not military money is my understanding. And the thing that, to go back to that, the thing that vexes me, is the sanctimoniousness around it and the explicit articulation of NORAD's military mission of continental air defense and nuclear warfighting or detection, whatever euphemism you want to use there. This notion that Colonel Shoup was, so warm-hearted and and then they did it all out of the goodness of their hearts. And it's like, no. Some people may have. I have no doubt that many of the people there are there for fun and for children and all that. And the systems and structures that we articulate ourselves to are not always so innocent and carefree, and in some cases literally and explicitly saw tracking Santa Claus as a way of taking heat off of or public displeasure with nuclear weapons mission and making that mission more domesticated and palatable. And also building, to a certain extent, a belief in efficacy of NORAD and its ability to track things. Like, yes, we all know that NORAD tracks Santa, or that Santa is not real. And also, the claim that you can track him is partially, over 65 years. Like, we can track Santa. Of course we can track ballistic missiles. They don't say this.
I mean, and that's crazy, right?
They don't say that. And I would argue, though, that that's part of the effect.
And people are going to be like, oh, that makes sense.
I don't think it has to make sense. It doesn't. It's the fact that NORAD is tracking something, and it's NORAD can track things.
But I think people in their mind will just be like, oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense, without actually thinking that they're not tracking anything at all because Santa doesn't exist.
Also, again, NORAD, using NORAD Track Santa as a way to highlight its technical capabilities of showing. So one advertisement had war jets going up to escort Santa, and some people got cranky about that because, oh God, war jets. And it's like, well, is that okay? So NORAD Track Santa, in addition to being a way of recasting or rearranging the sort of valences, emotional and otherwise, is also a way of demonstrating the mission of NORAD and claiming various forms of capability and success.
In my mind, it was just like, oh, Santa Tracker. But as you explain that throughout the ages, the way that they have advertised it.
It's older than I am by a lot. Well,
I mean, I knew it was old. You said the 50s it started, but I didn't realize that they actually had advertisements like that with jets escorting Santa.
So NORAD Track Santa partnered with AOL at one point, which is, for those of us who are internet kids, right? So now it's 2022, and NORAD Track Santa also still continues to produce TV clips and images for so CNN or, whoever can be like, NORAD Track Santa now reports, right? They release press releases and stuff. They provide content for other distributors and news, because it becomes news then that NORAD has tracked Santa and Santa is now entering the United States airspace and we've cleared a way for them. And again, in this very sanitized language, there's a lot of, which may not be different from what the FAA would say if they were running it, but the FAA doesn't have to be like, yeah, we could shoot him down if we needed to, sort of thing. Or the FAA doesn't invite jokes about that. NORAD Track Santa, if you spend time on the nuclear Twitter, that's a thing. Is this the year we accidentally shoot him down? Is this the year we mistake him for, right? So with NORAD Tracking Santa, there's always also that potential for a slide semantically and semiotically into those sort of more unpleasant aspects of NORAD's mission and its articulation to USA nuclear weapons and war planning. And that's part of why the touchy-feely good stuff gets slathered on. It helps to prevent that move. I'm thrilled that people have had good experiences. And I think that those experiences could be better and less fraught and more fun for everyone if we weren't explicitly articulating Santa to USA nuclear war propaganda for 57 years.
Happy holidays, my friend, from me, Shelley Lesher, at My Nuclear Life.
Our radars on the northern slopes have just picked up an unknown object over the North Pole. It's headed south at a very high rate of speed, 9 objects at 40,000 feet, descending rapidly. We're now scrambling jet interceptors to identify this unknown track. Holly and Frosty squadrons, this is Christmas Control. Target heading 300 degrees, speed Mach 2, altitude 40,000 feet.
Roger, this is Holly Leader, airborne, heading 300 degrees, climbing to Angels 40.
Roger, Christmas. This is Frosty Leader, airborne, vectoring on target at 180, climbing to Angels 40.
Roger, Frosty and Holly Leaders, this is Christmas Control. Continue on present headings. Make Angels 40. Your target, 9 unknown objects heading south.
Copy. Leveling at Angels 40.
Holly Leader, your target now 45 degrees right, 100 miles. Search high and low.
Roger, Control. Still searching.
Understand, Holly Leader. Frosty Leader, your target now 40 degrees right, 100 miles level.
Roger, no sighting yet. Hold it. I have an unknown contact, 35 degrees right, 40 miles.
Roger, Frosty Leader. That's your target. Proceed and identify.
Okay, Control. I have an identification. You won't believe this. It's you-know-who. A very fat man. He's dressed in red, and he's piloting a sleigh pulled by reindeer.
Roger that, Frosty Leader. We pick him up every year at this time. Attention all North American Air Defense Command radar, missile, and fighter interceptor units. This jolly old man and his cargo are to receive air defense escort and safe journey. Merry Christmas to all, and out.